Open your memory. Not an archive, not a museum, but the most ordinary room that many still remember from childhood. Against the wall stands a heavy sideboard. Behind the glass are porcelain dogs, shepherdesses, vases, cups, figurines that no one has touched for years. They are not used, they are not played with, they are not rearranged without reason. They simply stand, in their places, as if something depended on it. The official version has long been ready. It's supposedly fashion, habit, a display of prosperity, nostalgic domesticity. But there are too many oddities here. Why are glass doors almost mandatory? Why was porcelain placed not just anywhere, but on windowsills, in corners, on mantelpiece shelves? Why does the shape of old vases so suspiciously resemble the shape of high-voltage insulators? And why did the market for small porcelain figurines sharply decline precisely when cities began to be connected to wired electricity? Write where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Today, we're not just dissecting a beautiful domestic detail. We will try to look at an old interior as a trace of a system that was once understood and then forgotten. The theory is controversial, but it is precisely such theories that force us to look at familiar things with a new perspective. Because sometimes the biggest secret isn't in a hidden room or a sealed archive. It's right in front of our eyes, behind the glass, on a shelf, in Grandma's sideboard. At first, everything looks too familiar to seem suspicious. An old sideboard, dusty glass, brass handles. Inside, rows of porcelain figurines, like a small army of silent witnesses. And this was no rarity. Such a scene was found not in just one house or one city. It stretched across generations, through imperial apartments, merchant parlors, provincial homes, Soviet rooms with a carpet on the wall. Eras changed, regimes changed, furniture changed. But the principle itself, for some reason, held on surprisingly firmly. This is where the first crack in the usual explanation begins. If these are simply decorations, why were they treated almost like something functional? They were cherished, but not used. They were dusted, but not rearranged. They stood not as toys or as dishes. They stood as elements of order. As if there is a diagram in the house, and it should not be violated. Even people who couldn't explain why still preserved this arrangement. This is no longer a whim of taste. This resembles the inertia of an old rule that outlived its era. The most interesting part begins right here. When an object is too familiar, it stops being noticed. So it is with porcelain. People saw a figurine but didn't see the system. They saw a sideboard but didn't ask why it was arranged exactly so. They saw glass, a mirror, porcelain, wood, but didn't try to see them together. Yet sometimes the solution is hidden not in one object, but in how these objects are connected to each other. And to get closer to that solution, we must take the first step. Stop looking at porcelain as a trinket and look at it as a material with very specific properties. Porcelain seems fragile. That's where its deception lies. Pick up an old figurine, and the first sensation won't be about fragility at all. It's heavy, dense, cold even in a warm room. The surface is smooth, as if sealed. The sound from a light tap is high, long, almost musical. This is no longer just pottery. This is a material with a special structure that behaves completely differently from cheap faience or coarse clay. And as soon as we start looking at porcelain not through the eyes of a collector, but through the eyes of a technician, the picture changes sharply. Its main property is not in its whiteness or the beauty of its glaze. The main thing is that quality porcelain almost doesn't absorb moisture, withstands strong heat, and is a very poor conductor of electricity. That's precisely why it was used in electrical engineering for decades. Insulators, old sockets, fuses, spark plugs, all of this long ago linked porcelain not only to interiors, but also to technology. And here a question arises that is hard to brush aside. If the material is so good as a dielectric, why was it placed everywhere in old houses, and moreover, in the same spatial points? The difference with faience is also telling here. Faience is more porous. It handles moisture worse, loses its properties faster in dampness. Porcelain, on the contrary, remains stable where ordinary ceramics would be finicky. On a window, near a temperature shift, near a heat source, in places where air moves, where condensation appears, where the environment constantly changes. That is, in the most inconvenient places for simple decoration. And if the choice in favor of porcelain was repeated for centuries in homes, then people were attracted not only by beauty. It means this choice could have had a function. And a function always leads us to the next question. If the material was important, then why was the place where it was put equally important? Look at old photographs of interiors. Peer into memories of pre-revolutionary houses, merchant parlors, communal apartments, grandmother's rooms. Figurines almost never live chaotically. They aren't scattered across all surfaces like random store-bought decor. They have their favorite spots: the windowsill, the mantelpiece shelf, the corner of a room, the glazed display cabinet, the chest of drawers by the window, the wall space between windows. And this repeats too persistently to be called simply the habit of one family or the fashion of one era. Now pay attention to the flip side. Where was porcelain almost absent? On the dining table, where it would only be in the way. On bookshelves among volumes. On the bedside table. On random surfaces deep in the room. If it were only about beauty, people would arrange figurines differently. Someone closer to the sofa, someone by the bed, someone in the center of the table, someone on the writing desk. But the old interior is surprisingly stubborn. It seems to know the points where porcelain is needed and the points where it is superfluous. And that already looks very much not like taste, but like a diagram. It's especially strange that this diagram lived in both rich houses and poor ones. For an aristocrat, a sideboard can still be explained by status. But what was a poor owner demonstrating, who also cherished a glass cabinet and kept a porcelain figurine on the windowsill? Who was he trying to impress? The answer about vanity starts to fall apart, because vanity loves display. And here we see not display, but a discipline of space. The same points, the same rules, the same material. All of this leads us to the most suspicious object in the old house, the sideboard. Because perhaps it was not a cabinet for beautiful things, but a node where these things began to work together. A sideboard is usually seen as just a piece of furniture, and that's precisely what keeps us from noticing its strangeness. But take it apart, piece by piece, and it no longer seems so simple. Glass doors at the front, often a mirror or glass panel at the back, wooden or glass shelves inside. Between these layers, air and porcelain objects. What emerges is an enclosed interior space lined with materials that are well known in electrical engineering as insulators. Glass doesn't conduct electricity. Dry wood doesn't either. Porcelain was one of the best dielectrics of its time. And then an uncomfortable question arises almost on its own. Why would such a combination repeat so consistently if the furniture's only job is to keep dust off the dishes? Wooden doors would be cheaper, sturdier, and more practical. They don't break. They protect better from light. They're easier to make and repair. Yet sideboards again and again end up with glass. The official explanation is well known. You needed to display what's inside. Fine, but then why did glass doors also appear where there was nothing special to show? Why did even modest homes gravitate toward this form? It seems it wasn't just about visibility. The glass itself mattered, its properties, its role in the construction. If you look at such a cabinet through an engineer's eyes, the analogy suggests itself. Layers, gaps, insulators, surfaces. All of it brings to mind not just a display case, but the simplest capacitive system. Not in a literal everyday sense, and not as a ready-made device from a textbook, but as an object whose form aligns suspiciously well with electrical logic. And then the porcelain inside no longer looks like random filler. It becomes an active part of the assembly, something that heightens the overall oddity of the design. And after that comparison, the next step follows naturally. You don't place a cabinet next to a figurine. You place an old vase next to a modern high-voltage insulator. This is one of those moments after which the old picture never quite fits back together. On the left, picture an antique 19th century vase. With smooth curves, constrictions, flared rims, a glossy glaze. On the right, a modern insulator on a power line. It too has skirts, protrusions, narrowings, rings, a smooth surface. Of course, it's not an exact copy, but the similarity in principle is striking. And what matters here isn't the beauty of the form, but its behavior in an electric field. The more complex the surface profile, the longer the path a possible surface discharge must take, and therefore, the better the insulation. That's why electrical engineering loves textured shapes so much. They don't just decorate an object. They force current to take a longer, more inconvenient route. Every protrusion is an extra detour. Every skirt is added protection. Every constriction is another barrier. And when we see similar logic in decorative vases, the question arises almost automatically. Could craftsmen have been repeating a functionally ideal form for centuries purely by chance? Could the material, the glaze, and the profile have come together just by the whim of fashion? Proponents of the alternative version make their main move right here. They say, 19th century engineers didn't invent the insulator shape from scratch. They took an already existing layer of forms from porcelain production and adapted it to a new technical purpose. It's a bold idea, but it sticks precisely because the visual resemblance is too obvious. And if the form might not be accidental, then the next thing to check isn't the museum display case, but the house itself. Where in a room could such a form work not as decoration, but as an element of the environment? And here, the same points reappear before us. The window, the fireplace, and the corner of the room. A windowsill in an old house isn't just a convenient shelf. It's a boundary between two environments. Outside, cold, humidity, the atmospheric field. Inside, warmth, dry air, convection currents. Between them, glass, a frame, a temperature difference, and constant air exchange. Even without complex physics, one thing is clear. The window is the most unstable place in a room. Moisture gathers there. Air moves there. Two different environments meet there. And if porcelain, and not just any random object, was placed in such a spot for generations, that already looks meaningful. The mantelpiece is even more interesting. Fire, heat, hot air currents, soot, combustion products, the movement of dust and charged particles. A fireplace isn't just a source of coziness, it's a zone of strong environmental disturbance. That's exactly why everything placed above the fire had to withstand heating and remain stable. Porcelain fits here almost perfectly again. It holds its shape, isn't afraid of heat, doesn't absorb moisture the way porous ceramics do, and its smooth glaze makes the surface predictable. A little too convenient a coincidence. Now the corner. At first glance, the most boring spot in the room. But from the perspective of spatial form, a corner is always special. Planes converge there. Light, air, shadow, and everything else that's distributed unevenly across the room behaves differently there. The old interior seemed to know this. Corner étagères, display shelves, figurines, vases, placed precisely where the room's geometry creates a point of tension. If all this is coincidence, it's a remarkably disciplined one. And if it's not coincidence, then the logic should manifest not only in everyday life, but in documents too. And here, the alternative version makes its next move. It turns to old catalogs and placement guidelines. When an item is sold as decoration, it's usually described by its beauty, size, subject, sometimes price. But in old price lists and interior descriptions, researchers of this topic notice one strange detail. Items were often tied not only to appearance, but also to their installation location. For the window, for the fireplace, for the display shelf, for the corner. It sounds almost like a technical instruction hidden beneath the language of commerce. As if the main thing about a figurine isn't whether it's a shepherdess or a little dog, but exactly where in the room it should stand. Even without turning this into a sensation right away, the approach itself is suspicious. Why suggest a placement point to the buyer at all? If it's pure decor, the owner will decide where to put it. But the old interior too often turns out to be not free, but regulated. That's the nerve of this whole story. We seem to be facing not a collection of beautiful objects, but a set of elements distributed around the house according to a hidden rule. And this rule survives changes in eras, fashions, and social systems. From this follows the next blow to the official version. If porcelain really played only the role of a status symbol, it should have been concentrated where people wanted to make an impression. But we see something else. Repetition, systematicity, a domestic standard. And the more closely you examine this standard, the stronger the feeling that the old house was once understood differently. Not as a set of rooms, but as a space that had to be correctly assembled and balanced. Yet even this isn't the heaviest argument. The heaviest one comes from economics. Because any fashion can change slowly. But when an entire market collapses almost on command, it means it wasn't a decoration that disappeared. It was a need. Porcelain endured in European daily life for a long time. A very long time. Styles changed, wars came and went, dynasties fell, new tastes emerged, yet small porcelain figurines remained in demand. And then, suddenly, in the late 19th century, the picture changes drastically. The production of interior figurines, vases, and small decorative forms begins to shrink. Not to zero immediately, of course, but far too quickly for a mere shift in taste. Especially when you recall that it was precisely during these same decades that a new form of electricity began spreading through cities, centralized, wired, and controlled by power stations. It is here that the alternative version makes its boldest claim. It argues, the market didn't collapse because people suddenly grew tired of shepherdesses and little dogs. It collapsed because the old function of these objects was no longer needed. The home was gradually switched to another system. Instead of a distributed environment with porcelain, glass, mirrors, and an internal electrical logic, a network arrived. A wire, a light bulb, a fuse box. The point of control moved from inside the house to outside. Energy ceased to be part of the space and became a service delivered through wires. Of course, official history tells a different story. The industrial era changed tastes. New styles replaced intricate decor. But the coincidence of dates is troubling nonetheless. Because one thing is a slow decline in fashion. Another is the synchronous pivot of entire industries toward technical ceramics, insulators, plumbing, and electrical components. The same material, the same technology, but no more figurines in the home. It looks as though porcelain didn't leave the larger system. It simply changed its mask. And if there truly once was a hidden electrical logic in the home, then it must have had a source, which means it's time to look above the ceiling, to where the house's connection with the sky began. A lightning rod is usually explained simply. A metal rod receives the strike and channels it into the ground. It all seems logical, clear, but in old blueprints and descriptions, solutions sometimes appear that, from a modern practical standpoint, look strange. The conductor doesn't always take the shortest path. It may run through the building in a more complex way than needed for simple protection. Here, an extra route appears. There, insulating elements emerge. Elsewhere, the system looks as if it doesn't just divert, but also separates, accumulates, and redistributes. At this point, the topic of atmospheric electricity enters the story. And this is not fantasy, but a real physical phenomenon. The Earth's field exists. The potential difference between the ground and the upper layers of the atmosphere exists. The only question is whether this phenomenon was ever used not just in a lab, but in daily life. Proponents of the forgotten system believe it was. In their version, the roof and lightning rod were not just protection, but a receiver. Basements and insulating elements were not accidental complications, but part of an accumulation system. In the interior was a network of stabilizers and distributors. The most controversial, yet most thrilling turn lies right here. If we accept this logic, even as a working hypothesis, then the sideboard, porcelain, mirror, fireplace, and chandelier cease to be disconnected objects. They become links. Some receive, others dampen surges. Some hold, others distribute throughout the room. The version is bold, but at least it tries to unify what the official explanation leaves scattered as domestic trifles. And once the links become visible, the final step remains: to assemble them into a single diagram and see what the old house might have looked like as a whole. Imagine a 19th century house not as a collection of furniture, but as a three-dimensional circuit. At the top, reception via the roof and metal elements. Below, the path of the charge into the structure. In the basement, an accumulation zone, or at least a point of decoupling. Then, the room, where every large item serves more than just a domestic role. The mirror becomes not just a reflection, but a plane with a metal layer. The sideboard, a multi-layered node with glass, air, porcelain, and wood. The chandelier, not only a source of light, but a distribution center. And the figurines on the windowsill, in the corner and by the fireplace, local stabilizers. Notice how neatly other details of the old interior begin to fit into this picture. Bronze clocks on the mantel, metal candlesticks, candelabras, grills, hinges, handles. Everything once considered merely rich ornamentation suddenly starts to look like conductive points within a common medium. Not necessarily as complex devices in the modern sense, but as elements of a space that operated differently from our homes today. The old dwelling then ceases to be mere past decor. It transforms into an environment where material, form, and placement were chosen for a reason. And the most powerful aspect of this entire version is not that it promises a miracle, it's that it provides an internal logic. Why porcelain stood precisely there. Why glass was so important. Why mirrors occupied key positions. Why chandeliers were so massive and intricate. Why the interior seemed cluttered, yet remarkably stable in its composition. Everything begins to explain everything else. And it's at this moment that the most uncomfortable question for official history arises. If such a logic truly existed, even partially, why did it vanish so swiftly and so completely? The answer awaits us in the age of wired electricity. When new electricity enters the home, it brings not just light, it brings a new system of power over space. Before, if we believe the alternative version, the house was a tuned environment. It had to be assembled correctly, balanced, equipped, maintained. Now everything changes. The energy source is moved outside, to the station, to the line, to the grid. What enters the house is no longer an environment, but a service. It can be switched on, switched off. A bill can be issued for it. And everything that doesn't fit this new model gradually turns from a necessity into a relic. This is why the old interior begins to lose its meaning. Fireplaces are bricked up. Crystal chandeliers are taken down or simplified. Sideboards remain, but become mere display cabinets. Porcelain figurines continue to stand out of inertia, though no one can explain why anymore. Old-style metal ornaments begin to interfere with new technology, cause interference, create inconveniences, or are simply perceived as superfluous. And here we see the classic end of any vanished system. The form is still alive. The function is already dead. People continue to repeat the ritual, but no longer understand the meaning that once stood behind it. The saddest part comes next. The next generation begins to laugh at the remnants of the old logic. The porcelain figurine becomes a symbol of bourgeois taste. The display cabinet, a dust collector. Crystal, bad taste. Everything that once could have been part of a complex inner world is relegated to the category of meaningless junk. And along with it, memory disappears too. Not just memory of the objects themselves, but of how the home was once understood as a whole. And that's why today we only see fragments, individual vases, old mirrors, windowsills with strange traditions. But if traces have survived even in everyday life, then in larger buildings, they could have been even more noticeable. And the final turn leads us precisely there. Now let's take the last step and widen the scale. If traces of this forgotten logic could exist in an ordinary home, then what about the large spaces of the past? About temples with golden domes, gilded surfaces, oil lamps, bells, and special acoustics. About train stations under glass vaults and on metal trusses. About factory buildings with giant windows. About halls where glass, metal, stone, air, and height were combined not by accident, but with astonishing persistence. Perhaps what we see before us is not just the style of an era. Perhaps these are larger versions of the same idea that, in everyday life, shrank down to a display cabinet, a mirror, and a couple of porcelain figurines on the windowsill. We are not obliged to accept this version as the final truth. And that is its strength. It doesn't ask for blind faith. It makes us compare, to juxtapose, to notice what we once passed by. Why old forms so resemble technical ones? Why old rules of placement are so persistent? Why a material that turned out to be ideal for electrical engineering suddenly dominated interiors for decades? And why all of this began to disappear rapidly, exactly when the home was connected to a new, centralized energy system? Too many questions for mere fashion. Too many coincidences for mere taste. So next time you see an old display cabinet, don't be quick to smile. Look at it as a trace. A reminder that the past very often disguises itself as familiar, everyday life. And if you still have porcelain figurines, old-style mirrors, heavy chandeliers, or glass-fronted cabinets at home, at your parents' or at relatives, look at them more closely. Perhaps it's not just a memory of Grandma's room. Perhaps these are remnants of a system we no longer know how to read. If you enjoy investigations like this, be sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. We have many more stories ahead where the most important secrets are hidden not in sensational events, but in things that have stood beside us all our lives.